just very briefly, the players, the national players, the AOSIS, AOSIS, is the Association of Ocean and Small Island States, and they were a significant, highly visible and a significant voice at the talks. Unable to really advance their case very well, but they really were quite compelling, because these are all of the small island states that are dealing with the immediate threats of sea level rise. And you know, they had a very compelling story to tell, and they were really the sort of the embodiment of the urgency and the cost of having delayed so long to make progress. The G77 is the large group of developing countries. There actually are around 130, and they include China. They tend to negotiate as a bloc, although individual countries within that group also have their national agendas. China, particularly, but also a nation like Saudi Arabia calls itself a developing country, but on the other hand is a very hardcore power pushing for oil interests at all times, and they had a major influence on the talks, because they really blocked the effort to adopt a majority vote for the talks, and so they insisted that it be by consensus, and so getting consensus from 193 nations was pretty impossible. Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, and Nicaragua kind of led the charge against imperialism, and were insistent that this was really a battle between the North and the South, and so they were the very edgy voice at all times. The European Union was present, but kind of missing in action. They were sort of deferring to the U.S., and the U.S. was actually, one of the very good things is that the Obama administration sent 6 cabinet secretaries. They were, speaking, meeting with people, and just, evidence that the U.S. is finally going to be a player. So that was somewhat encouraging.
What's basic?
Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry, basic. I meant. That stands for the 4 countries of Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, and they. This was really the point at which they emerged as a major international player. This group of 4 countries. More about them later. Anyway, there were kind of 2 stages. The first 7 or 8 days were a long slog by the working group of representatives from the country delegations, a lot of meetings that went way into the night, and very little progress, just these delegates at loggerheads over very detailed text for these the provisions in these 2 documents, and there was really the sense that the talks were really going to come apart. Hillary Clinton did arrive the day before President Obama, and actually, her funding commitment was greeted. It depended on. There were a lot of perspectives about it. It wasn't received by all of the developing world as such a terrible. I forget what you call it. The thing was, this was a major commitment on the part of the U.S. to sort of make this $100 billion eventually happen. So it was seen as pretty significant. Then the heads of state started to arrive, and things took on this very different tenor, and most of us were just sort of excluded from the Dulles Center at that point, and so it became just a question of watching from a distance, and a lot of frustration over that. I just want to point to this document. The International Institute for Sustainable Development has a very detailed blow-by-blow account of what happened. It's actually quite accurate from all I can tell. And so if anybody wants to read in the specifics of what countries said what, go there. Next. So what ended up happening was President Obama came into Copenhagen on the 18th of December, the last day of the conference, and he proceeded to have side meetings with the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And the focus there is on the fact that these nations, in addition to the U.S., emit about 80% of the greenhouse gases. And so this is where the real opportunity is to make an impact. And if we don't have India and China on board, number one, we're not going to have any way to sell a bill in the U.S. Senate back home, but also we can't really make progress. So there were intense discussions with these countries, and they were quite far apart from everything that has been written about the meetings. A very big issue for China is they really don't want the international community being able to verify that they are reducing their emissions. They want to be able to tell the international community what they're doing. They don't want anybody watching over their shoulder. They also did not want to have short-term targets for emission reductions, and so that was something that was very much resisted. Over the course of the day, there were meetings with some other countries, and then as it's reported, President Obama actually had to try and convene this basic group again, and ended up having to crash a meeting that the other basic nations were having to try and push and get some kind of an agreement. So they got most of the way to finalizing what was this accord, which was it was a recognition. I mean, this is the most important parts about the accord: the recognition of the need to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees, recognition that there was a need for the developed countries to fund what the support for the developing countries, and finally that all developed countries, including the U.S., need to be part of the solution. I have a few more details on the next slide. So the 2-degree commitment, this was a commitment of resources by the developed countries. All of the Annex I countries, those are the developed countries, were invited to set short-term emission reduction targets. At the point that this accord was drafted, the sense was that they would get the UN as a whole the nations as a whole to adopt this accord, so that all the countries would end up entering a commitment for their own emission reductions in an appendix to the accord. And the non-Annex I countries, the developing countries, would identify the appropriate actions that they would take. So they're not going to make the same kind of commitments, but they're going to identify actions that they will undertake. The big additional issues were incentives to reduce deforestation and forest degradation, and this is just a huge challenge, and there's a tremendous need for funding to help developing countries step up to this. And then the funding commitments on the short term, $30 billion a year, and then by 2020 to try and develop a funding commitment of $100 billion, and that would be from all sources, private as well as public. And then finally, and this was a concession to the island nations, just committing that in 2015 there would be a reassessment to determine if the 2-degree limit was sufficient. The island nations were calling for a 1.5-degree limit, that we couldn't allow the temperature to increase above that.